Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Dr. Tesfalem Abate again, the Executive Chair of EPASA, the Ethiopian Professionals Association in Southern Africa. And I would like to say thank you to each one of you for being here with us today. We are very pleased to welcome you to this critically important event. Before we get started, I would like to express my sincere appreciation to all of you who generously helped us to make this event come together. And particularly, I would like to say thank you. I would like to thank the speakers for volunteering to speak in a very short notice. The Ethiopian Embassy in South Africa for supporting us with some logistics and helping us to reach out to a broader range of communities throughout the world. And the organizing team for devoting your time, knowledge, and resources. I would like to say a little bit about EPASA. And EPASA is an non-governmental, non-profit, and independent professionals association. And it is not affiliated to any religious or political organization. EPASA is registered in terms of Section 14 of Companies Act 2008, South Africa. And members of EPASA include, but not limited to, university professors, postgraduate students, researchers, engineers, and so on. The association is open to all professionals, Ethiopians, friends of Ethiopia living in southern part of Africa, and willing to support the growth and development efforts in the region and in Ethiopia is very much welcome. EPASA, in collaboration with the Ethiopian Embassy, has organized the conference to facilitate discussion among a wider variety of academics and the general public with an interest in finding a solution for the ongoing conflict. The keynote speakers and panelists will enlighten us on issues of diplomacy, media misinformation, disinformation, and reconstruction. We appreciate our speakers to stay within the stipulated time and audience not to interrupt. I ask the participants and plenaries to mute their audio and disable cameras except when they are speaking. By the end of the session, I hope that we will have a better idea of the conflict to move the way forward with the reconstruction and the rehabilitation efforts. Well, now I don't want to take much of your time. I need to leave the stage for our moderators, Mr. Jigayo Tafara and Professor Damto Tafara. And here I would like to make a note that these two individuals are not related by any means, but they are just members of EPASA. Mr. Jigayo Tafara is a senior economic researcher with a wide-ranging experience working in academic and think tanks, equipped with project management, economic data, and policy analysis skills. And she has been working with African peer review mechanism, APRM, since 2016. And in her tenure, she has served the APRM in different capacities, including coordinating the African Network on Corporate Governance of SOEs and coordinator for South African APRM member states. She has got 2 master's degrees in economics and developmental policy from different universities. And our other moderator, Professor Damto, is a professor of higher education and founding director of the International Network for Higher Education in Africa at the Universities of KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. He is convener and founder of the Higher Education Forum for Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and is a founding editor-in-chief of the South African Development for Higher Education and Training accredited journal entitled the International Journal of Higher Education. He coordinates the Higher Education Cluster for Africa Union, Continental Education Strategy for Africa with the Association of African Universities. Ladies and gentlemen, I now leave the stage to our moderators, and the first moderator is going to be Mr. Jigayo Tafara. Mr. Jigayo, yes, the stage is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tesfalem, for that generous and warm introduction. A very good afternoon to all present here. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Chikaita Farah, and I'm an economist by training. I'm currently working with the African Peer Review Mechanism here in Johannesburg, and I'll be moderating part of this webinar. Today here with us, we have 4 distinguished speakers, and I will now invite the keynote speaker, Prof. Baharu Zewde, to present his remarks entitled Lessons of War in Ethiopia. Prof. Baharu Zewde is an Ethiopian historian and an author, currently an emeritus professor of history at Addis Ababa University, is also founding fellow and the founding principal vice president of the Ethiopian Academy of Science and fellow of African Academy of Science. He was formerly chair of the Department of History and director of the Institute of Ethiopian Studies at Addis Ababa University. He has served in leadership positions in various Pan-African and national civic organizations, notably as an executive director of an independent think tank, Forum for Social Studies, as well as an editor of a number of journals and a member of International Advisory Board. He is a recipient of numerous awards and fellowships, and an author of several books and a scores of articles and book chapters on Ethiopia and African history. Ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to welcome Prof. to the floor. Prof. Baharu, the floor is yours. Do we have Prof on the webinar?
Okay, I think I'm okay. Thank you very much, moderator, for the introduction. It's nice to be back in South Africa, although virtually. I left South Africa about a week ago after a 5-month fellowship at Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Study. And I came back to Addis, and I found Addis Ababa more or less as I left it, except for the inflation and the cold that I have developed in the transition from the searing heat of the last few days of Stellenbosch to the freezing cold of Addis Ababa. I have tried to simplify the presentation by presenting it under 4 themes. First, the unresolved question of identity. Second would be entitled Disinformation Unbound or Unlimited. The third will deal with the US-led diplomatic offensive against Ethiopia. And finally, I will try to reflect on the challenges of the future. The question of identity is something with which I've been grappling for something like 2 decades. In the last few months, I spent my time in Stellenbosch actually exploring this even further with the hope of coming up with something. It is, as you all know, a universally contested concept, very often associated with conflict. Identity conflict is almost universal. You can see it in many different countries, whether it's in Ireland, whether it's in Canada, Catalonia, the Basque country, the Balkans, in Africa, different parts of Africa, and so on. And Ethiopia, of course, is no exception to this. The great challenge has always been how to accommodate multiple identities, particularly ethnic and national identity. This has not been so easy. How can one be a Catalonian and a Spanish at the same time, a Spaniard at the same time, an Irish and an Englishman, an Igbo and a Nigerian, a Kikuyu or Luo and Kenyan, and an Oromo or Tigray and Ethiopian? So this has been quite a challenge. In the Ethiopian case, I think in the past, we took it almost like an axiom that Ethiopia has one identity, and that is the Ethiopian identity. It was almost axiomatic. It was not even questioned that the Ethiopian identity has been there forever, for a long time at least. The Ethiopian state is characterized by considerable longevity as well as continuity. it has been there at least on the basis of the available records since the beginning of the millennium. From the time of Aksum, there is an almost uninterrupted succession of statehood with all the institutions and the traditions of the monarchy and the church from Aksumite times up to the present time. And in the past, until we may say the 20th century or the second half of the 20th century, Ethiopians identified themselves by region rather than by ethnic group. The region was more important than the ethnic identity. Just to give you an example, I mean, there was Amhara, there was a concept of Amhara, but people or the Amhara usually prefer to identify themselves by the region as Gojami or Gondare or Shawe or Wolloye, and even further down actually to go down subdivisions of Tagulati, Bulge, and so on and so forth. The same applied, I think, among the Oromo, although the idea of a pan-Oromo entity existed. Most Oromo, of course, identify themselves in terms of their clan or their tribe, Sibu, Leka, Salale, Borana, and so on and so forth. In addition to this, of course, at the ethnic level, there was considerable ethnic interaction, including intermarriages, ethnic intermarriages, under such practitioners as Empress Taetu. This was raised to the level of an art for dynastic purposes. You know, there was quite a lot of intermarriages within regions and also ethnic tribes. Haile Selassie's family also was tied by marriage to the houses of Tigray and Walaga and so on. And also, of course, this is at the elite level. It was not really plebeian. At the commoner level, I think, especially in urban settings, there was considerable intermarriage as well. So this was the pattern, basically. And also, if you look at the ruling class, it was not really composed, of course, predominantly, maybe you could say Amhara and Tigray to some extent as junior partners, as we always refer to them in historical writing. But there was a time when the Oromo played a considerable role in the political power structure in the 18th centuries, in the 17th and 18th centuries in the Gondar period. Eventually, of course, as you all know, culminating the dynasty, the Yeju dynasty, which came to an end only with the victory of Kasa or Theodros over Ras Ali II. So another aspect of this Ethiopian identity has been rallying in times of external threat. There are so many examples. Of course, you can cite from Adwa to Bademe, when Ethiopians united as one to fight external aggression or external threats. You have also, of course, the Italian invasion, which was short-lived, largely because of the Ethiopians rallying against the occupying force. The Somalia aggression of 1977-78 is another example. And if you look at the national icons that Ethiopia has, they come from different nationalities: Oromo, Amhara, Tigray, or Tigran. It was not really particularly one. I mean, one particular nationality that dominated the national icon picture. Of course, this pan-Ethiopianism was not without its stresses and strains, and this became more manifest, at least was articulated much more clearly in the second half of the 20th century, particularly with the student movement, which identified the question of national oppression, largely resulting from the campaigns of expansion of Menelik in the last quarter of the 19th century. So since then, of course, there has been a revision. There has been a counter-narrative, which is justified to some extent to come to some kind of accommodation of the pan-Ethiopian and the ethnic identity. I think it is largely so from this period that ethnic identity becomes prominent in Ethiopian politics. And the result, as you all know, of course, is the new structure, the new political dispensation that came into effect in 1991, which ushered in a period of ethnic federalism. It has had its blessings as well as its curse, what I could call the boon and the bane. The blessing, to some extent, of course, is that nationalities which until then were kind of submerged, were assimilated, or felt degraded, could raise their head, speak their language, could develop their culture and so on. But on the other hand, of course, it had led to kind of balkanization of the country, and particularly in the last few years, an unprecedented degree of ethnic conflict, which has made life very difficult for those living in the periphery in particular. At the same time, although the idea of ethnic federalism was meant to give autonomy to the regions, in actual fact, the whole thing was controlled by the party apparatus. So that autonomy was really in name rather than in fact. So in some sense, what we are seeing today, this war probably is the last act of this unresolved question of identity. Let's say that it's the last, not the latest. Let's hope it is the last, not the latest act of unresolved question of identity. So this is as far as the question of identity is concerned. The second aspect I want to deal with is what I have called disinformation unbound. I've chosen this title because it is so limitless, the amount of disinformation that has been spread by the mainstream media, not the social media. Of course, the social media is, we know what the social media is. That's one reason why I've never subscribed to social media. So I've been spared most of the ugly sides of this social media anyway. I don't think I lose much, but it is a mainstream media that really has been in the forefront of disinformation. I say disinformation rather than misinformation, because misinformation is something that you do by mistake, inadvertently, and disinformation is a deliberate act of lying to achieve a purpose, to push an agenda. That's what has been going on. That's what we have been seeing. For those of us, I think we have been disabused. Those who believe that the Western media or Al Jazeera could report the truth objectively in an unbiased manner, I think we have had our lessons. Quite a few. In fact, I heard that someone actually unsubscribed himself from the CNN. Many must have unsubscribed themselves from the CNN. Hardly any of the great icons of the mainstream media remain untainted, whether it is CNN is a different story altogether. New York Times, The Guardian, The Economist, and so on. In one way or another, there are always some pointed articles glorifying the other side, glorifying and vilifying the Ethiopian side. There's so many themes. One is that Tigray or the TPLF was the victim rather than the aggressor or the perpetrator. In spite of the evidence to the contrary, this nauseating refrain that I have called nauseating refrain of Abiy the Nobel laureate turned into a warmonger. I've dealt with this in my piece on disinformation, and war crimes have been elevated to genocide. War crimes, in war situations, of course, crimes are committed, atrocities are committed. They are unfortunately almost unavoidable. But what the narrative that has come, that has been pumped around with the help of the mainstream media and with the help of even high-powered individuals like Helen Clark, the former president of New Zealand, in the recent article of The Guardian, with which I took issue, they have been harping on this genocide story, in spite of the fact that the joint investigation of the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the UN Human Rights Body, nowhere in their account actually indicate that genocide was committed. And of course, even now, I think there's still this move is still not finished, still going on. And the last theme, of course, which was brief but was almost ridiculous, was this Afghanistan, the parallel with Afghanistan. So almost when as soon as the TPLF forces captured Dase and Kombolcha, Saba is falling. And lurid pictures, analogies, or parallels were drawn with the last frantic days of the fall of Afghanistan. Well, we haven't seen people falling off airplanes, taking off the tarmac and so on, but it is something that has been pushed to, it's a kind of part of the psychological warfare that has been unleashed against Ethiopia. On the other hand, of course, there has been a deafening silence to the TPLF atrocities in the Amhara and Afar regions, which are really unprecedented. At most, there have been some grudging concessions, very qualified admissions and so on. Probably, of course, I mean, I think this, as soon as some kind of the same, I think what one would like to see is the same kind of investigation that was done by the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the UN body to do the same thing for the Amhara and Afar region and come with a conclusive report. Then everybody will see the difference between the two. At the same time, of course, the campaign has been inextricably bound with the fortunes of TPLF in the war. When TPLF is advancing, they keep quiet. Basically, they just keep quiet, hoping for the best in their perception. When TPLF is being attacked or retreating, then there is the cry, the hue and cry of atrocities, of intended, projected, or actual by the federal forces, by the Amhara forces and Afar forces and so on. So, and then of course one just wonders why this ganging up. I don't think I have the answer to that. Maybe only the future will tell us why the mainstream media, which is supposed to be a respectable body, has chosen to tell only one side of the story. There are always two sides to the story. I don't think mainstream media have ever, rarely at least, I wouldn't say ever, they have rarely bothered to check or to get the views of the Ethiopian side, rather than they would have chosen to just trumpet the other side, TPLF side. The third item is the US-led diplomatic offensive, which is probably one of the most pathetic to some extent, one of the most tragic and pathetic, how the US, which has a litany of disastrous foreign policy fiascos all over the world, from Vietnam to Afghanistan, how it could commit the same kind of mistake. I think there was one session that I attended. I think it was a hearing in the US Congress. I think there was one very perceptive man. He said, "Is there no learning curve? When are you going to learn?" That's what he said. When is America going to learn that its disastrous foreign policies are not really based on sound reasoning and sound considerations? And as we all know, of course, the US has exerted all sorts of pressure, from sanctions imposed or threatened to psychological warfare, including, of course, the famous evacuation hysteria. Now we hear that actually they are saying that they did not actually tell their staff to leave the country because Addis Ababa was falling. They left of their own volition to celebrate Christmas. But of course, Christmas is very way away, farther from. It's not the time to go home for Christmas when they left. So anyway, this psychological warfare, which was trumpeted repeatedly, is, I think, a disgrace for a power like the United States of America. And what happened, you would argue, to the much vaunted independence of the European Union? The European Union is supposed to be a kind of counterweight to the US. It had shown us some independent leaders, like de Gaulle and others and so on, who stood up to America. Now what we see is the EU it's not only France, actually it's the EU as a whole, more or less singing the tune of America. And this is also disconcerting. Even more disturbing, of course, is the partisanship of the UN agencies, because governments follow their interests. Yes, membership organizations like UN agencies, of which Ethiopia itself is a member, are expected to be objective and impartial, and yet, of course, they have been caught on the wrong side most of the time. Why this brotherly one-sided stance of the United States, one would ask? One has come across various hypotheses, long-standing friendship with TPLF, quite a number of personalities who are close to the TPLF are still in the State Department or around the State Department. I think this is a well-known fact. This is one theory. The other is the GERD. They don't want the GERD to be completed. Since Egypt is a strategic partner of the United States, they are trying to help Egypt by sabotaging the GERD to check Chinese influence. I mean, if it is checking Chinese influence, this is probably the wrong way to go about it, because what they are doing is actually push Ethiopia further and further into the Chinese fold. And then there is a threat of Abiy's Pan-African agenda, beginning with the Horn of Africa, and eventually, of course, this kind of one voice for Africa kind of thing, which they are not comfortable with. These are all hypotheses, really. Some of them have validity, and some of them have some kind of loopholes, I mean, like the Chinese influence. I don't think. You want me to stop?
Apologies, Prof. Kindly try to wrap up your presentation. Yeah. You only have 2 more minutes.
I'm almost there. So none of them adequately explain the myopic nature of US foreign policy. How could one prefer a dubiously elected group to a duly elected government? How could one be so oblivious to the demographic and strategic?
It seems the professor needs to unmute.
Yes, Professor, I think you have unmuted yourself.
Yeah,
You're back now. Okay, thank you.
Okay. So this assault on pan-Ethiopian identity has actually succeeded in reinforcing it at a very dramatic manner, both at home and, of course, as we have seen very clearly among the diaspora. So the important task that remains is harnessing this powerful voice for reconstruction and development. And we're seeing already some measures being taken. The daunting task of reconstruction, I mean, it's just, and healing is quite daunting. What happened in Amara and Afar regions defies all the canons of war, not only the killings, not only the executions, the summary executions, but also destruction of the hospitals and the schools and other facilities and infrastructure. Quite amazing that even after all this, the partisans of TPLF still hark back to the narrative of genocide in Tigray, when genocide of even greater magnitude has happened in the Amara and Afar region. So there is on the Ethiopian side, however, also a need for a multifaceted communication strategy. I think Ethiopians tend to speak to themselves. Most of the time they speak or write in Amharic. One has to really be multilingual. So if you want to reach a wider audience, you have to use French, Arabic, English as well. So also I think there is a need to look at the TPLF and the people of Tigray separately. However unrealistic it may seem now, because most Tigrayans have sided with the TPLF, at the end of the day, they are different. I would still like to believe that they are different. And all ethnic-based parties have to learn from the disastrous experience and temper their ethnic agenda. Ethiopia's salvation lies in the primacy of pan-Ethiopian identity. The way the West has ganged up against Ethiopia, this has become an African, not just an Ethiopian issue. Thank you very much. I think I've finished now.
Thank you very much, Prof, for that wonderful presentation. Prof has given us a very clear background and context to the current challenge Ethiopia is facing. His presentation highlighted on the issues of identity, disinformation, and diplomatic challenge. that Ethiopia is currently facing. I will now open the floor for two questions that the audience would like to raise to the professor. I think let me just start by reading one of the questions that I'm reading here. One anonymous attendee is asking why the Western media has to misinform the world about the war in Tigray. That's one question that.
I didn't get that question. I didn't get that question.
Okay, so the question says, could you please explain why the Western media has to misinform the world about the war in Tigray?
Yeah, well, I'm afraid I cannot provide adequate explanation, you know. I mean, one has to really dig deeply into the kind of connections that they must have had. Well, to some extent, of course, you would like to believe that this is a false sense of siding with the underdog, so to say. But I think it goes more than that. But since I don't really have the evidence for any possible association, I will not really venture into some kind of statement. But there must be some explanation. And as I said at the end of that segment of my presentation, I don't really have an answer. Only the future will tell us why they behaved like this.
Okay, there is also another question, Prof, on the chat platform. It says, Prof, why does ethnicity supersede national identity? What is the primary carriers of this? This is a question by Lerato.
Well, I think this has been the case largely after 1991. Essentially because on the one hand, you had a constitution which actually promoted ethnicity, but it was to some extent legitimate. There's some background noise, you know, I don't know what. Okay,
let me mute Mike.
To some extent, it was legitimate that ethnic identity could be fostered, you know, that people should be proud of their ethnic background, their ethnic culture, their language, and so on. So that was one of the benefits, as I said, or the blessings, if you wish, of the post-1991 era. But at the same time, of course, there was no limits made to the extent to which this ethnic identity would continue to flourish at the expense of pan-Ethiopian identity. As a matter of fact, you know, there were quite a number of instances where pan-Ethiopian identity was deliberately discouraged. I mean, as a historian, I know what happened to the history discipline, you know. Ethiopian history is one of the areas that people could discover their common roots, their common background, and so on. The history was deliberately discouraged. The department was not closed, but the common course, the history 102 course that was given to all freshmen who came into the university was discontinued. It's only now that's being reinstated. So these kind of things, there are quite a number of measures. You know, I mean, you can cite many examples where steps were taken to discourage the expression of pan-Ethiopian identity.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you for that prompt response. Colleagues, can you please unmute Tamara Dabojo? I think I saw his hand first. If you can just allow him to speak or raise his question to Prof. We are really running out of time, so we might have to wrap up the session in the next 2 minutes. Okay, so I suggest we finish our session, Prof. I really wish to thank you for your time and for your eloquent presentation that you've given us this afternoon. I will now hand over the floor to my colleague, Dr. Damto Tefera. He will be moderating the next session. Dr. Damto, please have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, first of all, on behalf of the Ethiopian Professional Association in South Africa and the joint organizer of the event, the Ethiopian Embassy in South Africa, I wish to extend my gratitude to Prof. Anne Fitzgerald, who will be speaking on a topic entitled Course Correcting the Impact of Disinformation and Divided Diplomacy. I'm sure I'm not off the mark if I say that Ethiopians got the brunt of misinformation, disinformation, made up stories, and outright lies. Unlike any other time I recall in our recent history, I think Professor Baharu articulated very well that story. We have witnessed with great astonishment, in fact, even utter shock, that how facts are numbingly manipulated, stories are disgracefully cooked up, and analysis have been shamefully twisted. As someone put it, if I know they are telling lies on things I know, how am I to trust them on things which I don't? Well, recently, President Uhuru Kenyatta openly stated that he has stopped watching the major media houses, intimating his lack of confidence and trust in their reporting. We have witnessed how the media, the so-called international organizations and think tanks have been manipulated in a blatant display of self-serving political and strategic interests with an utter disregard to justice, truth, and diplomacy. Many of us are now learning, relearning, and unlearning the truth and the facts about the world as we know it, as we fast sanitize ourselves from established misguided discourses and tortured narratives developed and nurtured to sustain hegemony. This preface as a background, let me briefly introduce Prof. Anne Fitzgerald, which is an extensive resume, but I will capture a few lines in the interest of time. Anne is the director of the Basileia School of International Affairs and a professor in Wilfrid Laurier University's Political Science Department. She's worked both at King's College, London, University Center for Defense Studies in the International Policy Institutes, and at Cranfield University, where she was the director, Defense and Security Leadership. She began working in Ethiopia as a doctoral student and became course director for a UK graduate program delivered in Addis Ababa between 2008 and 2019. In 2014, the government of Canada awarded Anne the Queen's Medal for her efforts to support conflict resolution and post-conflict peace building. Anne is a board member of the Ditchley Foundation, a senior research associate for the Royal United Services Institute in London, and so forth. Anne, we greatly appreciate it if you share your perspectives in 20 minutes. The floor is yours, Anne. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Damtu, and thank you to the organizers. I hope you can hear me. Excellencies and the many people who are devoting time on a daily basis to these important discussions, so all of you in the audience. I've been asked today to speak on issues concerning misinformation, diplomacy, and reconstruction. So what I'm going to do is divide my short talk into those three areas and try to look at the issue, the impact of the issue, and what could be done in terms of course correction, because I think it's always healthy to look into the future, and we need to dwell on the past because that's where we get our data from, but also the propositions should point to ideas going forward. So let's start on the disinformation, and I really agree with the comments of the previous speaker. And in fact, I will try to curate some of my presentations so I don't duplicate much of what he said. One issue that has stuck out for me is that many of those reporting on Ethiopia and the crisis in Ethiopia have proven sometimes in a very embarrassing way, to be lacking of knowledge on the wider context and the recent history, all of which is complex, but certainly not indigestible and lacking of understanding for those who invest the requisite time to understand it. But because of the shortfalls in the analysis, a dominant narrative has emerged. And the impact is that policymakers pay attention to mainstream media, and you have poorly informed policies which are then formulated. And these policies, these poorly formulated policies, are very dangerous because they lead to more death, displacement, and destruction to humanity. And research and data will certainly tell a bigger story about the impact of these flawed policies in the future. So ideas for course correction. And in information error, governments must place a huge priority on staying ahead of the narrative. Being proactive in strategic communications, being progressive, and most importantly, being evidence-based. Being more secure as a country means being more open these days. These kind of announcements have come from countries like Canada and the UK these days. I mean, intelligence agencies will tell you that 95% of the intelligence they consume these days is all from open source. So the key to national security becomes transparency and openness. Another issue, modern day insurgency has regained contemporary relevance as a form of conflict. And this has a direct link with disinformation. For those of you who are new to the concept of insurgency, it by and large involves three elements: guerrilla fighters, people who are fighting at the front end, the pointy end of insurgency; an auxiliary, a group that goes in and out of communities, feeds the narrative, tries to keep the people on board, because at the end of the day, insurgency warfare is all about the people's warfare and winning over the support of the people, even if the people do not want to get involved in it. And then something interesting known as the underground. And the underground's responsibility is to study people, study human behavior, and react and respond to human behavior. And of course, in this day and age, that observation is not just about physical heuristics anymore. It is about keeping track of people's behavior on the internet, tracking people in terms of what they're saying, what they're doing. And this is collectively creating huge societal divisions. I think somebody's all right. So the course correction is research, desperately needed research in the area of social media propagation and what is called by cyberists and AI experts stance detection and stance analysis. And I think, again, when research, longitudinal research on these areas is undertaken in terms of the conflict in Ethiopia, many trends will become apparent. Another issue is proliferation of commentary without robust peer review, robust methodological inquiry, authenticity, veracity, and triangulation of sources. We saw this yesterday with the publication of the New York Times article. And I would propose that if the author had undertaken investigative journalism, interviewed some of the personalities mentioned in the article, like Adam Mohammed, done very simple things like track the deployment patterns of troops deployed for the law enforcement operation, which showed no use of forward operating bases, any decent analyst would have come to much different conclusions. So the proliferation of very weakly reviewed analysis and commentary is made more problematic also due to the fact that laws governing social media content are at the moment woefully lagging behind the realities of social media behavior on the ground. The impact is that different sides to a story become circulated and given credence to. And we know that with such polarized views, not even on the same radar screen. I mean, usually we can get anomalies from an analysis, things that divert from a general cluster of views and opinions. We do this regularly as researchers, but these are on two separate screens entirely, which normally means that, you know, something's badly wrong. And this is what is happening as a result of poor investigation, an investigation that lacks methodological robustness. So course correction, we need to take control of the knowledge that we consume, not only as Ethiopians, but as a global public. And governments should support civil society networks, as should international donors, to develop almost rubrics to evaluate knowledge reliability. and for organizations to be rated according to these rubrics to help the global public prioritize where it should consume knowledge from. Peer review and ethics approval processes should also not be compromised. And lastly, the development of African-based media organizations should be supported, capacitated, professionalized to the highest levels to take back the continent's narrative. Another issue, and this is a very serious issue, that modern day insurgency warfare involves high levels of threat and intimidation. These intimidation tactics are not new. I remember 8 and 10 years ago receiving letters from organizations like Tigray Online and Tigray Media House, because the research that I had carried out in the Raya region of Tigray, despite the many respondents it polled, departed in some elements from the TPLF narrative. This happened on other occasions. It's happened to numerous friends and professional colleagues. So tactics such as copying emails to all major media offices, all UN offices, all national delegations of major donor countries and others in an effort to dismantle your reputation, in an effort to silence you. And then there is now a network of social media agents who are on standby to reinforce this more publicly. So these are vilification strategies. Threats to your physical life are also sent, photos of places near where you live in efforts to silence you, letters written to employers, boards of directors, letters filled with fabrications to try and discredit you and your work. The impact is that innocent people trying to do their jobs properly are harassed, their lives are disrupted, and some lose their jobs and their livelihoods. This is a major impact on human rights and the rights to privacy. Mental health issues and stress on the individual are also impacted due to a lot of mental trauma that people suffer. Course correction on this, these issues need to be reported to the highest authorities, and evidence needs to be turned over to national authorities and, in more serious cases, Interpol. Another issue, agents of intimidation and societal infiltration is one of the biggest threats to national security these days, particularly in diverse societies. Many civil society organizations, including think tanks and universities, become targeted for this infiltration. Things like cyber hacking, robot registration that plugs up these events, and which prevents diverse views and diverse levels of participation. The impact is that the literature being produced on debates on some of these issues is not subject to diverse views and robust debate and discussion. So course correction, know who you're working with, carry out due diligence of the organizations that approach you, and ensure online events benefit from diverse voices and that outputs are subject to diverse voice peer review. This taps in academic freedom of expression with so many voices being silenced. The course correction on this is that there must be a society-wide campaign to encourage diverse debates. Ethiopians have never been before, in my view, been so strong in their capacity to critically analyze publications. Encourage this, stand behind academic freedom of expression, freedom of journalistic expression as well, and make mandatory, especially in universities at every level of an organization, studies in research ethics, research methodology, data analysis, data science, curation included. Let's move on to the second issue, divided diplomacy. I won't repeat the points that were made by the previous speaker, but just like national governments must work to international standards and international law, so must the international system of governance adhere to its own principles and standard. These include getting behind a sovereign, legitimate country, and Africa is really raising its voices on this issue. African solutions for African challenges is another principle that's been spoken about prolifically for years, especially by Western donors. Let's see it lived up to. The principle of non-interference, the accountability that applies to the United Nations, especially senior leaders of international civil services. True leadership would call for such accountability. Failure to do so leaves the world in a very shambolic and despairing state. Humanitarian assistance should be delivered in a nonpartisan, fair, and equality-based way. In the context of Ethiopia, it should be prioritized to all conflict-affected communities. And we've seen an abject failure to cater for the many communities that have been disrupted and destroyed across Amhara and Afar for the sake of propping up a narrative that is keen to suggest that there is only one region affected by conflict in the country. The use of child soldiers is a war crime and has been responded to in a very robust way in different African countries, including South Sudan, Northern Nigeria, and Uganda. That it has not been discussed in the context of Ethiopia is very worrying. Same with sanctions. We all know sanctions kill, but threats of sanctions and threats of punitive measures need to also be delivered in a fair and realistic way to all sides of the conflict. Failure to do so disincentivizes certain sides of a conflict to stop fighting and stop engaging in violence. So in the wake of the internet, forensic investigations and open source data collection must be continued to be collected, and investigations should not stop. I agree entirely with the last speaker that a similar joint investigation that was carried out in the Tigray region must be initiated soonest in both Amhara and Afar. And I would finish on the diplomatic element by saying that external actors should consider a plan B because which there is still time for, because plan A is not working. It is impossible to deliver fairly, equitably, and impartially humanitarian relief with an organization that is prioritizing an armed insurgency. The goals, humanitarian goals and insurgency goals, are incompatible. Lastly, let's look at Reconstruction prospects. I think the intention must be towards declarations of peace and democracy, the declarations that 80% of those eligible to vote in the country made a commitment to. And if it looks as though the military outcome will play out in favor of the federal forces, then I think peace and democracy statements, commitments, declarations must be prioritized. Whereas rule of law needs to be upheld for those who are found accountable for high crimes, a magnanimous approach which supports many TPLF affiliates who would not have had anything to do with decision-making, command and control at strategic level, and would have in fact had no choice but to support what we've seen over the last, certainly over the last year. This approach needs to be prioritized. Enabling space for this group and other groups to organize politically in whatever way they would like to organize must also be accommodated, but also space for legitimate opposition groups, some of which have not been permitted to operate in the region for a number of years. Critical services and infrastructure must be prioritized. This is part of insurgency warfare, and unraveling the impact of insurgency requires this, restoring banking services, power grids, which I should say there is evidence that have been destroyed multiple times by the TPLF, the power grid at a cost of over $11 million US. And I'm using one example of infrastructure. There are other examples as well, but these things need to be rebuilt. Critical services need to be delivered to the people with the greatest of speed. Community social programs, truth and reconciliation efforts, and alternative livelihood for the former fighters also need to be prioritized. Urgently, reforms to the security sector that don't give a direct line of authority between regional militia and regional presidents. Humanitarian effort, fair, equal, transparent efforts, federally administered, with mutual support mechanisms, I would say, across all three conflict-affected regions. And if after all of this, a referendum on separation for Tigray is desirable, then this should be supported by the federal government. But the priority voice here needs to be given to the people, and enabling space for plural politics as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anne, for that excellent analysis and deeper reflection, and more so your way forward. So what I'm going to do now is I will actually go directly into some of the questions that are already raised here. Let me start from Canada. Interesting. Why Canada, of all the Western countries that may seem reasonable and neutral, is now playing an active role in disinformation and becoming appendages of the US? Is Western democracy heading to deathbed as the media has become propaganda machine rather than the traditional responsibility of informing the citizen? I think you already articulated Africa-based media and how this needs to be supported. I think you can probably lump these two together in your response.
Thank you. Yeah, interesting question about Canada. Canada's biggest ally and partner is the United States of America. That's a well-known fact. And I think Canada has played an important role in not blindly following the US narrative and using more realistic words like a commitment to reconciliation, to peace, and to dialogue, rather than using words such as negotiations without preconditions, which of course would push any national leader into a corner and risk a national leader losing his or her popular support. It's the same thing as trying to push the Biden administration to a negotiating table with the insurrectionists that stormed Capitol Hill after the election in the US. So, but what Canada has also done is follow the US in putting a travel advisory out, which is similar to that which the US has, to signing the statement, the letter that we saw published last week by Canada, the US, UK, Denmark, and the Netherlands, which was somewhat flawed, I thought, as well, because it implied that there were only, in this state of emergency that Ethiopia is under at the moment, only those of ethnic Tigrayan background are affected by the state of emergency, which is not the case. And it also cited reports that were carried out in one region and ignored inadvertently or advertently what was going on in the other two conflict-affected regions. So we've seen a bit of a middle ground being taken by Canada, but I think it is important to note that the Prime Minister of Canada seems to be speaking with the Ethiopian Prime Minister quite regularly. So we've seen Canada engage leader to leader in a way that it hasn't engaged in a long time. So I think it is setting itself apart from others, albeit quietly. How to build media capacity? Well, I think that Ethiopian African media need to reach out to continental experts that are located in the continent as well as further afield. We're living in the virtual era here, so it's very easy to bring people in, as this conference is doing at the moment, to ask hard questions as well. I mean, I've taught postgraduate programs in Africa for many years, and they're always my best students, and the intellectual capacity on the continent is rich. And so let's platform some of those people, and let's build a culture, a national culture across the continent for people to speak out openly, irrespective of what background, what region, what religion they are from. And lastly, like I said during my presentation, I think the idea of rating knowledge sources is very important as well. So that introduces a bit of competition. So if somebody achieves, say, a C rating after civil society has calculated the performance of some of these organizations against an agreed upon rubric, then that organization will no doubt fight harder to try to climb in its rating. And this will promote a sense of responsible reporting, responsible analysis, and it will have people gravitating more to those highly rated sources of analysis. But this has to be led by civil society, even if it's paid for by national governments or the international community. It really has to be driven by civil society. So it's all connected. We support civil society, freedom of expression, freedom of academic expression, freedom of media and press, support for good, strong, robust, methodologically supported analysis. So I hope that answers those two questions.
Let me compound a number of questions, and I'll give you a very small window of time to respond to it. One is why are the mainstream media so careless when reporting about conflict in Ethiopia, for that matter, Africa? And then the next person would be asking, is there any jurisdiction or a court of law to challenge this blatant lies about the media? But the last one, just because of time, I have to cut it short. That was, how can we start reconstruction before ending the war? And is this not a premature proposal? So I will leave it to you, but please try to be as concise as you could possibly can.
Thanks, Professor Damto. Can you just tell me the first question again, please?
Why are the mainstream media so careless in reporting about conflicts in Ethiopia, for that matter, Africa? And is there any jurisdiction, for that matter, or court of law, according to the person, challenging these blatant lies?
I think the most obvious reason that there's a lot of irresponsible reporting at the moment is that people are racing to be first to the mark. Remember, media is all about money. And what I didn't go into in my presentation is the role that money has played in this conflict. And research will tell a story about that in due course. But the media is guided by money as well, and media is in many cases very politicized. So we shouldn't underestimate the role that money and profit plays and trying to incentivize people to get their stories out first, no matter what kind of shaky ground the facts sit on. Is there a court of law? I mean, I looked into this after the CNN story about the Tekezi River and the white phosphorus on bodies that were found. And because CNN removed some of that detail and changed the story without following proper media ethics, which call for an explanation as to why those changes, specific changes have been made. And I think, if I remember correctly, the explanation that was given simply referred to, updated to reflect the situation on the ground, which was not the case. And it's very difficult to follow up on those things. I mean, I think these efforts have to start nationally. The creation of an independent media ombudsman or ombudsperson office. I think if we can't see any traction on these issues from the international community, and I think it's going to be a long time before we see a proper international oversight body on internet governance, which is desperately needed at the moment. The efforts need to start nationally and then resonate out. So link into the regional economic communities, regional economic mechanisms, and then hopefully gravitate to the international level. The last question about ending the war before Reconstruction, it's a really good question. And I totally accept that it was something that I should have talked about prior to delving into Reconstruction. Yeah, ending the war is really important. It's important for the country, the people, for the world, everyone. But the international community has an important role to play in ending this war. And I feel very strongly that one of the reasons why it is still ongoing is because there have been no punitive measures or threat of punitive measures lodged towards the side of the conflict that has not only started the conflict and the war, but has expanded and prolonged the war. And I find the silence on this issue is startling. At best, we've heard encouragement for both sides to cease fire and come to the negotiating table, etc., which is not the answer. So I think that until the international community incentivizes, I've got an echo there, both sides to the conflict. And the incentive, obviously, for the federal forces would be for the killing to stop, for the insurrections into other regions to stop, for arms to be laid down, and for the threat to diminish, at which point in time the defensive posture can also be stopped. But until that happens, and until incentives are given for that to happen and encouragement, there will be, the counter narrative to that is that there will be an incentive to continue.
Thank you very much.
I hope you can hear me. Yes?
Yes, we hear you.
Yes. Yeah. There are a lot of questions here. I think in the interest of time, I will simply not allow it and then hand it over back to the next one. I think the Jigayo for the next speaker. If there is any time, we would most certainly entertain some of them as relevant to the next speakers as well. The reasons why I did not entertain some of them is because those items that are raised are yet to be covered. Jigayo, back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Danto. Our next panelist is Ambassador Professor Kubai Jahazbhai. Professor Kubai is a full professor at the University of South Africa, where he is researching on Islam, Arabic, and the Horn of Africa's international relation. He is currently acting director of the project in the UNISA Vice Chancellor's Office. He was awarded a doctorate in international relations from the University of Witwatersrand. He is director on the board of Institute of Global Dialogue. He also served on the African National Congress National Executive Committee Subcommittee on the International Relations, and was South Africa's accredited ambassador to the state of Eritrea between the year 2012 to 2016. He is the author of the book Somaliland, An African Struggle for Nationhood and International Recognition. and is a member of an advisory board of the Journal of Eritrean Studies. I will now invite His Excellency Ambassador Kubai to give us his speech. His speech is entitled Ethiopia, a reflection of an African, a reflection of a South African. Dear Ambassador, please take the platform, and you have 20 minutes to make your remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, moderator, Ms. Ijikayo, and thank you also to the organizers, the Ethiopian Professional Association in Southern Africa, as well as the Ethiopian Embassy accredited to South Africa, for bringing us together. And it is indeed a delight to be on the same panel, such as with the eminent panelists, such as the iconic Historian, Prof. Baharuzadeh. And much of what I'm going to be saying in the next few minutes is going to stand on the shoulders of what was said early on by Prof. Baharu, as well as Prof. Anne Fitzgerald, so that I could provide some perspective as a South African, and as a South African in the sense of a student of the Ethiopian dilemmas and the current situation, as well as a practitioner, as was mentioned. I spent 4.5 years on the ground, and I've continued to follow developments in the Horn of Africa in terms of my publications and attempt to understand the situation in Ethiopia, as well as within the larger context of the Horn of Africa, as well as was mentioned by the moderator, the South African governing party, the ANC, has quite a bit of healthy contact with the ruling party in Ethiopia in the era of Prime Minister Meles Zenawi, as well as during the current era of Prime Minister Abe. And from many of our visits to Ethiopia and in attending the EPRDF governing party conferences, as well as the current interaction with the current Prosperity Party, it has given us a better sense of what's happening. So much of what I'm going to be saying would be within the AU continental constitutional framework, as well as drawing on the excellent scholarship of a number of scholars, such as the Malawian scholar, Prof. Paul Zeleza, the Kenyan late father of African studies, Prof. Ali Mazrui, as well as the current Ugandan professor, Prof. Mahmoud Mamdani, and much of his framing of the dilemmas, the contradictions we are trying to manage within our continent. Now, I know Prof. Baharu has developed a very good foundation for much of our discussion today, and in terms of how we would frame these issues. I know one question you would be thinking about: why is South Africa, a country on the tip of the Southern African continent, so interested in developments in the Horn of Africa? And the sense I'm getting is that many of our policymakers, many of our members of the ruling party engaged in the past with many Ethiopians, and the training, the support we had received from Ethiopians in our struggle against the apartheid government. But also the fact that South Africans have been following developments in Ethiopia within the larger context of the Horn of Africa, to also see what role they could play and what lessons they could glean from the Ethiopian experience, given it's the second most populated country in Africa, and given also that it, in our own homegrown way, developed the largest dam in Africa, the Gerd Dam, the Great Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. We all know that external players under pressure from those countries you know, and perhaps those you don't know, and the international financial institutions did not want to fund the development of the Gerd Dam. But we know the Ethiopians, with their ingenuity, the resilience and creativity, made it happen. And for that reason, we believe that we need to follow. And the good thing is that we find a lot of top South African economic entities, for example, Vodacom South Africa, along with Safaricom Kenya, the two giant mobile companies on our continent, have now entered the Ethiopian space to see how they could contribute towards the stronger telecom sector in Ethiopia. And I'm glad that has happened with a conglomerate of companies. And I saw on my last visit to Addis Ababa in the beginning of September that those companies are now beginning the process to roll out the new mobile phone license by early next year. So that's a very positive sign, and a sign which will say to many of the investors that it is worthwhile looking at Ethiopia in a positive way for its reconstruction, for its development. And I've observed in the many visits that I've made to Ethiopia from the year 2000, how Ethiopia has evolved and developed. And I believe the current setbacks can be overcome. We've seen this in many parts of the continent. My first book, which was published, an academic study of the case of northern Somalia, known as Somaliland, I've seen it when I went there in the year 2000. I'm not exaggerating that when I visited the Somaliland capital of Hargeisa in the year 2000 in August, it was really a ghost town. And now when you go there, I mean, I've been visiting it since I stepped down as the accredited South African ambassador to Eritrea, you would think you are in some flashy Italian or South African restaurant, because many of the diaspora Somalilanders have come back and invested in the country, and they've brought it to the point where it is. And we also see now that the Ethiopian government has also strategically decided to use the port of Berbera on the Gulf of Aden as a strategic route for many of its imports and exports of goods. And the good thing is also the Ethiopian government has shares now in the port of Berbera because of the interlinking strategic interests between Ethiopia and Somaliland. Let me touch on 3 points in the limited time I have. The one issue is, I believe, the Ethiopian-Eritrean friendship agreement, the peace declaration between the two countries, is a seminal homegrown agreement. It has shown us that when the two main protagonists, the leader of Ethiopia and the leader of Eritrea, decided it was now time to develop a peace pact, given they've seen too much of the destruction of war. They've seen how the development agenda of both countries had been set back. They found a homegrown indigenous way to make it happen. And I know the South African policymakers and many other friendly African policymakers did everything possible to make sure that the Algiers peace agreement is implemented. And once Prime Minister Abe in May 2018 identified an Ethiopian exile leader who had spent a lot of time in Eritrea to go and approach the Eritrean President Isaias to explore whether President Isaias would be willing to accept the olive branch, if you like, in terms of Prime Minister Abe's willingness to implement the Algiers peace agreement. And once that happened, we then saw the evolution of the Ethiopian-Eritrean peace declaration. I think, like Prof. Baharu had mentioned, the lessons to be gleaned is that you can have the potential, and there is the potential for homegrown African indigenous solutions. And that is what matters in any situation. But we've also seen, and I saw yesterday, the Munich Security Conference report was released. The only good thing I saw in that report, it used a very, I thought, interesting phrase. The phrase says, there's a lot of geopolitical traffic in the Horn of Africa, meaning too much of external interference. So I think it was correct for Ethiopians in the different capitals of the world, including in Pretoria, in Johannesburg, to say and demonstrate in front of American embassies and different capitals that no more external interference. And I've seen this firsthand in my 4.5 years on the ground in Eritrea. Prof. Ann mentioned the impact of sanctions, and I've seen it with my own eyes when we as an embassy had to bring in some, essential supplies we needed for the embassy. We had to go through the extra mile to convince airlines that sanctions does not apply on essential embassy supplies to come through either Egypt Air or Turkish Airlines to Asmara, or some of the other supplies. So we've seen that this punitive measures are just not helpful. And I think what we've also seen is the approach of the US towards Ethiopia has just put the US into a corner of its own making and has given the full space to China to further develop and invest into Ethiopia, as well as into Eritrea. I think it was the year 2017, I made a follow-up visit to Eritrea to follow up on this party-to-party ties between Eritrea and South Africa. And I got to see with my own eyes once again, the Chinese had decided that Eritrea is the place to be, as well as Ethiopia. And they decided to invest and build a $500 million embassy in the Eritrean capital, Asmara. I think you see the same thing happening, that many of the construction contracts are rightfully given to the Chinese companies now in Ethiopia, because they've taken a much more positive, much more helpful approach in approaching the reconstruction, development, and a much more helpful diplomatic approach towards Ethiopia as well as to Eritrea. So from the South African side, let me conclude this point. The South African policymakers have tried to do everything possible. I could expand on this later as to how we've tried to do so from the diplomatic side. Let me conclude with 2 points in the limited time ahead. I think historians, political analysts will have to study more closely how Prime Minister Meles had to deal with some spoilers in the TPLF Central Committee. I'm referring to Sabat Najjar, I'm referring to Getachew Reda, and many of those others. I know from the many interviews I had done with him when publishing my first book, I could see that he really didn't want this war with Eritrea. But you could see in the Central Committee, there were these, I would call them rent-seeking individuals who had looted from the state, and many of the intelligence agencies all over the world know those accounts they have in many parts of the world. Yeah, they have the names of the accounts where they are squirreled over, and those rent seekers, Prime Minister Meles, I recall in many of the EPRDF conferences, put this on the table in his political report that this rent seeking has to stop. But we all know that he couldn't quite manage it, and then he would have very difficult decisions to make. So I believe analysts would have to study that very closely and how he had to navigate the situation to take Ethiopia from where it was at that point, develop the infrastructure, make it a middle income country, which was his vision, and how to also navigate these Central Committee members of the TPLF who wanted to unseat him. I think that history has not been given. And we also know that I think if we do an analysis of the many interviews with President Isaias of Eritrea, he would analyze the time when the TPLF and Eritrea's EPLF were in the same trenches to unseat the government of Mengistu. So often the TPLF comes up with this narrative of bravado. And but you would find that President Isaias would make it known that had it not been for the central role of the EPLF, the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, and many of the abducted Russian tanks, which they entered with into Addis to and into the Mengistu's palace up there on the hill, we would know that they wouldn't have been able to genuinely liberate Addis, if you like. So I think that history also has to be looked at very closely. And I think now on YouTube, there are a lot of video materials in this regard. And also those generals who led the war of Ethiopia against Eritrea, many of them now have written some memoirs, and some of them have been translated into English, where they've confirmed their worst fears that when they tried to free up the Eritrean port of Assab, the huge loss of life. And the one general mentions that when he came back, he found himself in a very difficult position where he had to cry because this was a serious loss of life. So my point here is that that history has to be taken into account, that context has to be taken into account. And the point Prof. Anne mentioned of complexity in understanding the situation for us to have a better, clearer understanding of Ethiopia. I know in many of my discussions with President Isaias Afwerki, and of course, at the time where they had a mutual goal, that is the Eritrean People's Liberation Front and the TPLF, but he felt very betrayed by the TPLF of what they had done later, where then they started this war with Eritrea, and then they expelled a huge number of Eritrean successful businessmen. And now he's, I think, sharing these experiences with his Ethiopian partners of now how not to repeat history and to see how we can take this forward in terms of the reconstruction of Ethiopia. And I saw the other day, the Ethiopian government's, the cabinet has approved the promulgation on national dialogue. I believe this is an excellent point ahead. And I know the Ethiopian Prime Minister has written to President Cyril Ramaphosa, and they're looking forward to gleaning from many of the South African experiences of reconstruction and the questions of how to manage what we call military groups or insurgent groups or right-wing groups, as we would term them. Let me stop here.
Thank you, thank you. I was just going to say that we are running out of time, but if you may, please conclude your remarks in the next couple of minutes. Thank you.
No, thank you, Moderator Ijigayo.
Thank you, Prof. And thank you for your wonderful insights and for echoing the motto, African solution for African problem. It really, really is appreciated. And I personally enjoyed listening to your presentation, sir. There are a few questions raised in the chat platform. I know we don't have much time, but I will pick some of the question and I will ask you to respond, sir. The first question that I'm seeing here is that, Prof, how do you see the silence of the African Union towards the unfair treatment imposed by some Western countries to a country which is trying to its best, to build a democratic leadership? And what should the AU do in the future to handle situations such as this? This is a question forwarded by Dr. Paulus. Prof, if you may give us your response. Thank you.
Yeah, I think when developments unfolded last year, November, we saw the African Union chairperson consulted with the key players on our continent. And for one of the few times, given that the African Union Secretariat and the Commission is located in Addis, but they issued a statement. And I think Prime Minister Abe, even a few days ago, announced that he's been in constant consultation with the AU chairperson, that was Musa Faki, and also when President Ramaphosa of South Africa was chairperson, I think you know of that initiative where the South African president appointed 3 special envoys. And diplomacy is best done quietly. There's no such thing as speakerphone diplomacy. It's best done quietly. And I think we've reached this point now where, as a result of much of the quiet diplomatic initiatives of the African Union current chairperson, as well as some of the former chairpersons of the African Union, that is the Troika, South Africa, DRC, and so forth. Now we've reached this point where the Ethiopian cabinet have approved the framework document on national dialogue. So I think there are some positive signs ahead. We all know from the South African experience and other experiences, going ahead will be a long, hard journey, but we've seen that if you could pull together the Ethiopian-Eritrean Peace Declaration, nothing else is impossible. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Your Excellency Ambassador Prof. Koba. I will now end this session and hand over the platform to Dr. Ferry to continue with the next panelist. Thank you, sir. Dr. Damto, you may now take the floor.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ejikayo. Our next speaker is Ato Mesfin Demise, Director of Public Diplomacy and spokesperson of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Democratic Republic of Ethiopia. Ato Mesfin steps in for Ambassador Dina Mufti, who initially was the speaker at this event, but due to some urgent national duty, he couldn't be able to do so. Ato Mesfin will speak on the impact of the conflict, challenges of infrastructure, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. As we have witnessed the horrific scenes of destruction in industrial scale, we fully recognize the massive effort to rebuild and reconstruct the affected regions. Ato Mesfin will provide us a glimpse on the devastating impact of the conflict and massive rehabilitation endeavor that awaits the nation. Ato Mesfin, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Actually, I get the topic just yesterday, just in this morning, because Ambassador, as you said, had to have a different assignment today. Anyways, based on the topic I'm given, it's all about the destruction, what happened in Afar and Amhara regions, and especially the atrocities, human rights abuses that are committed by the TPLF. But since the overall idea of this discussion is related with the media, the way the media is handling Ethiopia's case and the way how we have been responding to that, I think it's better to relate the story of the destruction with how the media have contributed to that. So I will frame my presentation into 3 parts. The first one, how the media corrupted our image and our interests through misinformation. And the second one, how it also corrupted our interest through underrepresentation. These 2 things are very different. So when we have got good things, they underrepresent the story. Especially I'm working here as a media director, and I know how the media especially treats Ethiopian stories that have got that could have that could have introduced us our good sides. Anyways, the third one will be what shall be done then. What can we do? How can we reshape our or what can we expect from the media and the international community in this regard? What's the best way out of this conflict? Not only out of this conflict, but also to rehabilitate things to their original place or normal life. So before going into the details, I would like to congratulate our embassy in Pretoria, South Africa, and the Ethiopian Professional Association in South Africa for organizing this discussion on a very important topic that is bothering our countries these days. As I said, my first topic will be the media and the response given by our government. So although propaganda has always been an integral part of any armed conflict in the modern world, what we are witnessing today with regards to the Tigray conflict has opened our eyes, in the sense refers to Ethiopians and friends of Ethiopia like Professor Anne. It opened our eyes to many unprecedented realities Actually, I've got a master's degree in journalism, and the things that I'm experiencing these days, the way the Reuters and the AP, the Agence France Press and Associated Press and CNN and so on, those media outlets, which once I look up to as a role model medias, then the way they treated Ethiopian stories is very amazing to me. Then there is a blurring border between propaganda and journalism, and that's really a new reality to me. My education was about objectivity of the media and impartiality, how to treat stories impartially, objectively, and how to give equal chances to different stories. At least in a story, there are different actors, so how to give equal chances to. So all of these things are, I'm trying to, not only me, but many people are trying to see these things in a different light now. I think you will agree with me. So what Ethiopians once revere as genuine and objective mainstream media outlets have gravely fallen from their grace in the eyes of many Ethiopians. We have found many of them reporting in Ethiopia, wearing colored glasses. So as a result, they kept on faltering from their much touted journalistic creed of reporting based on impartiality and neutrality. As you all may recall, the Ethiopian Media Authority has issued a warning statement last month. This is the first written warning statement given to the main media operators in Ethiopia, foreign media operators in Ethiopia. But it gives me, when I read that statement, it gives me the whole sense of Ethiopia's complaints against those media outlets. So I'll go through them one by one, but quickly. And as you know, the first point was Ethiopia accused these media outlets for manufacturing and disseminating of false news. Mind you, that's false news and news analysis on Ethiopia to assist the objectives of armed groups. Armed groups in this sense refers to the TPLF and sometimes the OLA. You remember the much media hype created regarding the story of the encirclement of Addis Ababa, or the siege of Addis Ababa by these rebel groups. And we know there are some actions taken by some corners in the world, some governments stationed, some embassies stationed in Ethiopia, about telling their citizens to evacuate from Ethiopia immediately. This is a huge psychological warfare to us and to everyone. It gives us a different image, and it gives to everyone, every foreigner, a different image about Ethiopia. So it costs us a lot. And the second main point was reporting the law enforcement operation as a genocidal campaign. And let me add another one, number 3, reporting that the government is using famine and rape as a weapon of war in the Tigray region. Fortunately, these 2 points are abundantly debunked by the joint investigative report of the United Nations and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. So I don't have to talk about them more than this, but still some stories about this genocide and famine as a weapon of war are lingering in newspapers and media outlets still today, but their impact is waning. The other one is producing defamatory reports on the country's leading institutions. You remember the story about the Ethiopian Airlines. You know how Ethiopians are proud of their airline, and its history, its destinations. Ethiopians, it's not only in economic terms, but it gives us some psychological, I don't know what to say about it. It is one of our best institutions that survived with many ups and downs and turmoils in the market. So attacking this institution is just like, it amounts to attacking the pride of Ethiopians, not only their pockets. So the other one was generating news seeking to discredit the country's leader. I'm talking about Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, especially, they relate, whenever they write a story about the Prime Minister, they relate him with somehow with the Nobel Peace Prize story. And I read a story about, by the way, I'm happy to share this platform with Professor Bahar. I read a story about this Prime Minister Abiy's presentation as a warmonger, even though he took the Peace Prize in 2019, as if it is I don't know how Professor puts it, but it's, people consider it as if, consider the Nobel Peace Prize as if it is, as if Prime Minister Abiy had to give the other chief when he's attacked from the different side, as if he's not a commander-in-chief of the country, and as if he's not the prime minister of the country. So he has got many responsibilities, but somehow this story lingers until today. If you remember, there is a story about a story written by Declan Walsh about what's going on in the northern Ethiopia. He wrote a latest article on New York Times, and he still talks about the Nobel Peace Prize and this one. And it's very amazing to us, even though it's ridiculous, but it's, these are in a nutshell, we are not happy. The government is not happy with the media because of these things and the malicious intent of using these things to attack Ethiopia. So unfortunately, what's happening today, the attack by the above stated media outlets, yes, the above
Excuse
media.
me. Excuse me.
Yeah.
You have spent half of your time,
Okay.
and I encourage you to focus on now the challenges of infrastructure rehabilitation and reconstruction. Thank you.
Okay. So let me focus on the second point then. So anyways, these were the misinformation part. So how did the underrepresentation of our stories is hurting us today? So this, despite the information war, Ethiopians are also suffering from the deafening silence of the media and its underrepresentation of atrocities committed by the TPLF. That's one thing. In the Amhara and Afar regions, unfortunately, some countries and international organizations have failed to expose the atrocities and destructions in the Afar and Amhara regions, taking politically motivated and double standard positions over the matter. These are the basics, the meat of the story. We believe that these underrepresentations of Ethiopia's image, underrepresentation of Ethiopia's stories, and supporting TPLF in different ways in the propaganda and so on. These are politically motivated and a manifestation of the double standard positions taken by the international community, some corners of the international community. So as you all know, many people in the two regions have lost their lives, were displaced, and were left with destroyed infrastructure. Just to mention a few examples, you remember the Galikoma massacre in Afar, where more than 200 people sheltered in makeshift centers were massacred, many of whom were women and children among these. And you also know the Maikadra massacre, I think is very well known now, where again, based on international reports, more than 200 people were massacred just because they were from a different ethnic group. You have heard what happened in Agamsa. The entire village was razed to the ground. So the mass killings in Gashana, Ansokia, North Shore, and other places too. These are the massacres and mass killings. And the scorched earth techniques that the TPLF follows in invading the Afar and Amhara regions showed us the destruction of public and private goods and the livelihoods of communities in these regions to an unprecedented level. The TPLF soldiers did not stop by looting ready to be harvested crop and killing cattle and farm animals, but they also destroyed all that they could not consume or take back to Tigray. So they are compromising the livelihoods of many people for many, maybe years to come. So that's the challenge to us. The other one is the number of people that are affected by this conflict. According to a recent report of the National Disaster Risk Management Commission of Ethiopia, Mutuku Kasa, he was having a conference here in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where he said there are 1.8 million people are displaced by now, and 8.3 million people are in need of food aid. So 8.3 million people is just maybe it's more than the entire people of the Tigray region. So reports by the Amhara regional authorities have also indicated that due to the TPLF's invasion, the region needs 40 years of effort to regain what has been lost. 40 years is a long time. So schools, health centers, and airports, hotels, factories, and many other infrastructures was razed to the ground by the TPLF. I think those of you who are familiar with social media, then you have seen the pictures and so on. I also heard the president of Afar's media, the president of Afar regional state, he was having a media interview yesterday, and I heard him saying that the region has lost at least 10 billion birr worth of infrastructure due to the conflict. So the government is conducting investigations and documenting the extent of destruction in this regard. So we are expecting many things to reveal. With the liberation of remaining occupied areas, many other TPLF atrocities and destroyed infrastructures will come to light, we hope. By the way, the destruction in the Tigray region was also witnessed by the Ethiopian government. As you know, before it evacuated its troops last June, due to the declaration of the unilateral humanitarian ceasefire. Back then, if you remember some of the stories that are related by our media outlets and from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the government has tried to establish a civilian administrative structure and rehabilitate affected people and rebuild destroyed infrastructure. But unfortunately, the rebel groups were determined to destroy what has been rebuilt. And as you know, there were 18 people who were repairing electricity lines and telephone lines were killed there. So these were the challenges, and the TPLF could not give I don't know what to say, a guarantee to the lives of these people. So it's very hard to take life back to normal in that region again. So these are the challenges. So what shall be done? What are we expecting from the international media? And what are we expecting from some of the influencers in the world, international community? So our main challenge is impartiality, as I said. The international community is reluctant in holding armed groups accountable to their misdeeds. So lack of impartiality from the media and the international community is incorrectly judging what is going on in Ethiopia. As I said, politically motivated and double standard approaches have exacerbated the conflict. So the main rhetoric here is demonizing the government while showing tendencies to whitewash the crimes of the TPLF. So the script didn't change, since the eruption of the conflict in November last year. So had the TPLF accepted the unilateral humanitarian ceasefire that was declared by the government, and had the international community supported this initiative, all the deaths and destructions of properties would have been averted. Humanitarian food and non-food supply routes in Amhara regions were blocked, as you remember, while the Afar route was compromised by the TPLF because of the TPLF invasion of the two regions. So the group invades the neighboring regions, and at the same time demands the food supply routes to be opened, and this is absurd. At least people. So the last one.
Sorry, Ato Mesfin, I would encourage you to conclude. Yeah.
Okay, the last one.
Yes.
The second point in the last part is, so we need diplomats and leaders of international organizations as a first step, including the media, to pay a visit to Amhara and Afar regions, regional states, and witness the level of atrocities committed there. If you remember, there was a statement by the United States, about unconfirmed stories of the destruction, and this is unfortunate. Anyways, to confirm it, please come and visit that. We want the international community and the media to visit and confirm what happened there. And the second and the most important one, we need the international community to encourage the recent decision to have a dialogue, a national level dialogue. If you remember, the day before yesterday or 3 days ago, there was the Council of Ministers has endorsed the draft proclamation for the formation of a National Dialogue Commission. It will impartially facilitate and organize. This commission will impartially facilitate and organize the national dialogue between political elites and the public at large to foster consensus and build shared understanding on crucial national issues. And the last one, but the dialogue will be the government-led one with possible support from the African Union and from AU-assigned experts from member states, including the High Representative for the Horn of Africa, His Excellency Olusegun Obasanjo, and we need support in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I appreciate that, Ato Mesfin, for that extensive background of what really happened and what is expected. In the interest of time, I would read a few questions. I don't see some of them for some reason. I think this question probably would be directed at you. It doesn't say who. This is from Professor Jonas. Is it appropriate from diplomatic perspectives for WHO director to advocate for his party, TPLF, by using a WHO platform? Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, Professor, I think is it for me? Is it directly to me? Is it a question forwarded to me?
Yeah, if you wish.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
If you wish.
Okay, I think anyone who can answer this one very easily. The United Nations is an impartial. One of the principles of the United Nations is to act impartially and not to interfere in the political and domestic affairs of any country. So, Dr. Tedros, even though he's an Ethiopian, at this point in time, he holds one of the international organization positions. So we don't expect him to comment on our internal affairs, let alone support the armed groups that's attacking the legally and legitimately elected government of Ethiopia. Anyways, yesterday or the day before yesterday, we have had a discussion with the leader of WHO in Ethiopia, and we have some dialogue with him about the misbehaviors that we have observed from the WHO General Director Tedros. So anyways, the simple answer is it's not acceptable, and we have filed many times about this, the misdeeds of Dr. Tedros to the United Nations Secretary General. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think kind of a follow-up. Are the mediation efforts of President Obasanjo bearing any fruit? Asks one. Would you like to comment on that?
I would like to say it is on the way. And I think the government has already declared its intention for dialogue, to have a dialogue, and it has already established a committee. It's established, what was the name, the exact name? I don't know. But anyways, the cabinet, the ministerial, the cabinet has already decided to have a committee that can facilitate this dialogue. So Obasanjo will be part of that. So I don't know about the fruits, but it's on the way. And I think we have got the motto of solving African problems through African solutions, giving African solutions to African problems. And Obasanjo will be part of the problem, I think. He's an African and he understands us better than any other country, any other person.
As the last question.
Yeah, okay.
As the last question, I think you can relate this question to the earlier comments you made. Will the national dialogue, someone asks, lead to a national constitutional convention or not? This is actually Professor Minga. That would be the last question.
A national, can you come again? A national?
A national dialogue would lead to a national convention. That's what I understood it to be. Let me read it again okay, let me read it as is. Will the national dialogue, in quotation, lead to a national constitutional convention or not? That was Professor Minga.
Okay, let me rephrase her question in this way. And I took it directly from the statement issued by the Prime Minister Office regarding this issue. So it says, let me read it here. Based on the Council of Ministers last week has endorsed draft proclamation for the formation of a National Dialogue Commission based on the pledges made by the newly established Ethiopian government to have an all-inclusive dialogue at a national level. Look at this sentence: to foster consensus and build shared understanding on crucial national issues. So these are the two main points: to foster consensus and build shared understanding on crucial national issues. So does it include anything about constitution? I don't know, we will see. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I think, I'm sure the audience have benefited from your extensive reflection and also background perspectives on this issue. And thank you very much. With that, I will hand it back to Dr. Tesfalem, our convener. With that, thank you very much. So may I take it over from here to actually invite His Excellency Ato Emmanuel to give his concluding remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, distinguished organizer and speakers, distinguished guests and participants. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to join and address closing remarks on this very timely and far crucial current issues of Ethiopia, when the country has gone through challenges posed by actors both from inside and outside. I would like to forward my special thanks for the organizer, especially for ETPASA, respected speakers and all invited participants for setting of this timely discussion, fruitful deliberation and participation. Thank you for all of us. Thank you for the successful engagement. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't know if Dr. Tesfalem is still around.
Yes, I'm back, Prof.
Okay, please carry on.
All right, thank you. I would like to say thank you to everyone, to our speakers, to the organizing team, to the people who actually attended the meeting and then participated actively in the questions and answers. We really appreciate that. and we also invite people to join as a member of the association and then to support what we are doing. And some questions might raise up at some point and concerning what we do and why we are organizing this event. And what we do is we literally support education and the transfer of knowledge amongst communities in Africa and within South Africa and Ethiopia. And we support the two countries to the best of our knowledge and to the best of our capacity. And therefore, here is the information. And if you want to join us, you can contact us with the details, info@ipasa.org or main@ipasa.org. And if you want to support us financially, we also have displayed the banks, our bank details in here. And if any of the medias will or any of the media associations or enterprises who are attending this conference, you are very much welcome to communicate with us, and we are very much happy to address whatever questions we have. And finally, I would like to say thank you to our excellent facilitators, Professor Damto and Mr. Gayo. And we also kind of feel pity that we did not have the question and answer section, which was exhausted between the participants. And I mean, like when we move from one panelist to the other panelist, and then I hope we will be organizing similar events, conferences in the near future. And therefore, I'll say thank you to everyone. Have a good night.